Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I think this has been a very much long-awaited hustings, actually. We've got well over 300 people signed up, and I think people have been continuing to sign up into this evening. So I think we're going to have a really fantastic debate this evening. My name's Liz Zeidler. I'm the co-founder and chief exec of an organisation called Centre for Thriving Places, whose entire role is to put well-being of people, place and planet very much at the heart of decision-making at a local level across the UK. So this is an issue very close to my heart. And this husting is being largely hosted by the Bristol Green Capital Partnership, which is one of the largest networks of green organisations, in fact, I believe in the world, but certainly across Europe, with which supports over 1,000 organisations in the West of England to connect, to collaborate, and to take action on both the climate and ecological crises that we are currently facing. I think a link is going to be put into the chat so you can find out much more about the Green Capital Partnership, but also about the many other partners who've been involved in setting up this event today. They and we all feel very strongly that this is a really important event. We need to be hearing from all of the West of England mayoral candidates, their response to the climate and ecological emergencies, and how they're going to do that in both a fast and a fair way, which is really important to all of the partners involved in this event. We're offering a platform. We've offered this platform to organisations across the region to ask about what really matters to them on this subject. And today I'm very much just representing them. I'm reading questions that other people have created, and we're going to be reflecting on those issues that have mattered most in the very large amount of consultation we've done before this event. There's a small chance we may go over the originally advertised time to about 7:45 at the latest, because we've had so many questions, and we also want to leave enough time, if necessary, at the end to expand on that conversation with the questions that we're going to be inviting you to include today. I'm going to go through a few sort of housekeeping ground rules first. The Zoom chat function is available. It's not always for webinars, but it is available during the event today. So please feel free to use that to share your thoughts and your comments. But it's really important, and we ask you really strongly to do that in a way that is, you know, respectful and considerate. We will be moderating it, and we have a very definite zero tolerance attitude to any kind of abusive comments on that in that space. So we will be moderating it very closely, but we really do want you to be able to voice your thoughts throughout the day, throughout the evening. We're also asking you to submit your questions, but within the Q&A, not in the chat space. So please do add your questions in there, and there'll be an opportunity for you to vote up or vote down those questions so we can make sure we're asking the ones that matter most to you during the rest of the day. I've been asked to give a tiny bit of background to why this is so important, just to give a tiny bit of context before we start. I'm sure most people listening know that, but I'm going to outline why these things are so important at this particular moment. So not only is this a big year, there are big ambitions for the West of England, but it's also crucial that this is seen as a now or never moment nationally and globally. Of course, we've got the COP26 taking place in Glasgow this year in November, and there is a huge push around the world for this to be the moment where we really do genuinely turn the tide. All three of the local authorities in the West of England have declared climate emergencies, as has WECA itself, and all have set targets for their areas to be zero carbon by 2030. And I cannot overestimate how big a target that is. 2030 is not far away. So we need today to be hearing answers that give us a chance of hitting that 2030 target. We also face an ecological emergency, as acknowledged by both Bristol City Council and Bath and North East Somerset Council. And immediate action is to reverse ecological decline is also, of course, incredibly strongly needed. The West of England Metro Mayor has a great deal of influence over how the region will respond to these emergencies over the next decade and beyond, and how they will meet those ambitious targets with specific powers, particularly in housing and transport, education and skills. So we really need to find out from our candidates today how they have the vision and commitment to ensure that the West of England leads the way at this absolutely crucial time for our planet. So I hope that gives enough of a basis for us to understand how important this issue is, but also how important it is that we get the right Metro Mayor to deliver on those very ambitious targets. I have to start, you may well have noticed on your screen that we have to start by announcing that very sadly, rather at the last moment, we've had to have a pullout from Dan Norris, the Labour Party candidate. He has sent us a statement which says that I'm very sorry I can't be with you all tonight. Unfortunately, events beyond my control have meant that I've had to cancel my appearance this evening, but I want to thank the organisers and all of their partners and the many people from across the region who've signed up to attend. I hope you'll be able to join me at other hustings scheduled for this week, and please email me with any questions that you have. So he, I'm afraid, will not be joining us this evening, but we still have 3 fantastic mayoral candidates in front of us who are all ready to answer your many wonderful questions. So I'm going to just briefly introduce them. We have Jerome Thomas, who is representing the Green Party. We have Samuel Williams representing the Conservative Party, and we have Stephen Williams representing the Liberal Democrats. But very, very briefly, before we hear from the candidates, we want to hear most importantly from you, the audience. And we will throughout this evening have not many, but a few brief poll questions for you to answer. So my colleagues at the Green Capital Partnership are going to put up this question on the screen, and please feel free to quickly answer. So do you know who you are going to vote for in the West of England mayoral elections? So your options are yes, I'm just here tonight to hear more, sort of, but tonight could swing it, and completely undecided, it's all to play for. Please, if you could, you've just got a few seconds to respond to this quick poll. And as you do that, I would really like to remind you that the deadline for registering to vote is midnight tonight. So if you haven't already, then please sign up. It's incredibly important that our democracy is strengthened through this process. And I think people often underestimate the importance of the West of England mayoral role. So please, let's not do that ourselves. I think we have got a result. So we've got quite a lot to go on tonight. There's some preferences, but tonight could definitely swing it. So I hope that will give us some really strong impetus, if we needed it at all, to fully engage with this topic as we go forward this evening. Oh, do I need to click share results? Can you all see the results? You see those results? So yeah, there's a 65% of those on here have some preferences, but they are waiting to hear from you. Great. Okay. Thank you very much for that poll. So we're going to go straight into the first question. I've already briefed the candidates that I'm going to be a fairly tough chair, I'm afraid, today. We're giving them quite short amounts of time. The reason for that is that it's really, really important that we get through these questions. We had literally hundreds of questions submitted, and a team of people, some very senior people from across the region, have worked on those questions to try and bring them into different categories of questions. So we're reflecting as much as possible of other people's questions. So I will be reading those questions, not making them up as we go, because I want to make sure that they're very clearly responding to your questions that you've sent in. The first one is very much an open offer to the candidates themselves to tell us in an opening pitch what are the first 2 actions they will take in office, which will ensure that the region's response to the climate and ecological emergencies are both fast and fair. So the first 2 actions to make sure that those responses are both fast and fair, and of a suitably large and ambitious scale for those commitments that we've made. I'm going to start first with you, Jerome, and I'm only giving you, I'm afraid, 90 seconds for your answer. So over to you, Jerome. Oh, I'm going to unmute you. You need to unmute. Perfect, thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz, and thank you to Bristol Green Capital Partnership for organising this evening, and for everybody who's come. My goal as the Green Party candidate for Metro Mayor, and it's the same goal for so many people, is a sustainable low carbon future that works for everybody. My first action would be to oppose Bristol Airport expansion. Bristol Airport expansion will result in huge growth in the region's carbon emissions. And the region's politicians to date, in particular Labour and Conservative, have failed us in the way that they've addressed this challenge. My second action would be to launch a West of England Citizen Assembly to concentrate on climate change and the economic recovery. A citizens' assembly would represent the full diversity of ages and backgrounds in the region and would give us a solid basis of consensus for the way forward. And I say this based on what's happened in Bristol, where my fellow Green councillor Paula O'Rourke and Asher Craig have recently organised a citizens' assembly. And what we've learned from that was that citizens will choose radical action when appropriate. So the goal of 80% of journeys by 2030 by public transport or active travel would be fantastic. And similarly in France, we've seen that the Citizens' Assembly has decided that short-haul flights where trains can be taken for less than 3 hours is also an appropriate way forward. So those would be my two immediate actions for the fast and fair approach.
Great, thank you very much, Jerome. That's good and clear. Okay, next up, with your first two actions on making our response both fast and fair, could I ask Samuel Williams to give us his opening remarks?
Good evening, and thank you for joining this evening. It's a really delight to be with you. And I'm delighted to say that I am committed to delivering a greener and more sustainable future. And our long-term sustainable transition, yes, is of course about reducing greenhouse gases and improving biodiversity and these elements, but it's also about our region's future economy. It's about jobs, it's about skills, it's about research and innovation. These things are also inextricably connected to securing that greener, fairer world that we want to see. And it's my view that through strong, innovative and collaborative, importantly in collaborative leadership, we can become a leading light in driving forward a restorative economy, a restorative environment and biodiversity. And that is absolutely my vision, so that we can become a leading light in this area. My view is we must approach this in two broad perspectives: adaptation and innovation. So firstly, adaptation, that's the challenge to do stuff differently. And so I will strengthen WECA's commitment to green and just and affordable transition by implementing a sustainable development goal lens to everything decision making that happens across the organization, from strategy to planning to transport to infrastructure and more, so that we have that clear science-based approach. And secondly, my commitment to you and indeed our planet is that I will be launching a Building a Brighter World award, because we need to innovate our way out of this, and creating an award that will incentivize and attract inward investment for that new innovation that will start tackling and taking hold of the opportunities that there are for green economy restoration. I will be committed.
Thank you, Samuel. Okay, good. Okay, so we've got two commitments from two of our candidates. Last but not least, can I invite Stephen Williams from the Liberal Democratic Party to give us his two actions for a fair and fast transition.
Hello everyone, thank you Liz for introducing us all. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I'm going to put in the chat a link to my manifesto, which I've called Agenda 2030. And there's over 100 ideas in there of how we can make sure that the West of England is far greener and far more socially just by 2030. So it's a plan for a two-term mayoralty. Lots of things we can do immediately, but also lots of things that are going to take 4 years, 6 years, 7 years, or a decade to finally embed into good practice and changing behaviour in the region. But in this introductory remarks, you've just asked me to give two things to give you a flavour of what I'd like to do, and there are two things that need to be done quickly. So the first one of those is something I would stop, because sometimes politicians can affect change by stopping things that they think are bad. There's a general presumption in my manifesto against building new roads. There are two new roads that are currently being proposed in South Bristol. One is a continuation of the South Bristol road link to Whitchurch. I would stop immediately any West of England Authority officers from working on that project. I would also stop the A4 Relief Road running through the west of Brislington along the Callington, to finish the Callington Road link. I think that would be far better served as a cycling and walkway and an ecological corridor as well. So that's what I'd stop. But I would start immediately. I would switch those officers into doing the work to get bus franchising in place. That is a power that has been available to all of the regional mayors since 2017, and the current Conservative mayor, who's been completely unambitious across a lot of things, has not taken up that power. I would start it.
Great, thank you very much, Stephen. Really good and specific. That's what we like to see. Okay, we have another brief poll. I know that's very soon after the first one, but the others will be a bit more spread out, but we think it would be interesting to hear from you. Do you think the actions set out by candidates are enough to match the ambition of the region and scale of the challenge faced? The answer is yes, definitely. Yes, to some extent, or some of the actions, because obviously we're talking about all of the responses we've heard, and no, not enough ambition across the board. So yes for some of them, no for none of them, or yes for all of them. So there we have it. That's a pretty good endorsement. There is yes from some of the candidates or for some of the suggestions, but there's a good percentage there suggesting that we still haven't got enough ambition across the board. And in fact, I might share one or two bits in the next few questions of some of the background data that might add weight to that idea that we perhaps need to be even more ambitious than we often think we need to be. But that's really useful. Thank you, everybody, for taking part in that poll. Okay, so we are going to move into some different themed areas. Those themes have been chosen from the areas which we had the most questions on in advance, but please may I remind you that you can add questions to the Q&A, and I can see that that's already filling up, so our team are looking at those as we speak. I will be reading out those questions that have been chosen instead of the people themselves, because we've had so many that we thought it would just take too long, but please know that there's a hugely diverse range of people and organisations that have submitted these questions. So the first theme is looking overall at the climate emergency, and particularly initially at the transport question, which I know has already been touched on by a number of those initial responses. Transport, I think, was probably the single biggest area of interest within our initial questions. And this is the question that I'm going to be asking you, that WECA have identified they need to reduce road-based transport emissions by 18% year on year, and yet the UK has not made any carbon reductions in transport in the last decade. Now, that is an astonishing fact, but it's true. Within the powers you have as a Metro Mayor, how are you going to prioritise investment to ensure this happens in order to meet the carbon neutral target of 2030? And if it's okay with you, I am going to just read one or two very significant bits of information about this. So road-based transport is responsible for 32% of all carbon emissions in the West of England. And while other sectors have reduced their impact on the environment over the past decade, transport has not. So whilst WECA has declared a climate emergency, many of the suggested ways that we're going to move to that carbon neutrality take at least 12 years to implement. So we're really looking, I think, the partners across the board are really looking for ways that we can achieve this target within that 2030 ambitious aim for carbon emissions reductions, which we have singularly failed to do both locally and nationally over the last 10 years. So please, could you give us your responses to how you will use your powers to prioritise investment to make sure this happens? And I'm going to start on this occasion with you, Samuel. You have 2 minutes for this one, by the way. Sorry.
Liz, thank you. Yeah, this is a huge challenge, isn't it, that we know is ahead of us, that we hear that 32% figure of carbon emissions across the region. It's a huge challenge. I can't see that we can really expect people to transition away from car usage unless we provide a real workable alternative. We recognise that at the region, Bristol, Bath in particular, it's easier to get around. Although still not ideal, it's easier to get around in the urban areas. There are significant portions of the region that is rural or sub-rural that people are still needing to rely on cars and or buses where they are available. But therefore, my approach is to really take the bull by the horns and deliver a workable public transportation system that becomes a preferable option so that we can leave our cars at home. Until we do this, I don't think we'll start to see the transition that we need. And this needs to be rapid, it needs to be quick. We need to start investing in systems and approaches to public transport. So for me, an integrated transportation system is my ambition, with integrated ticketing, taking on further the powers with enhanced partnerships so that our buses, our trains, our micro mobility is easily accessible through an app on our mobile phones and a single ticketing process, and getting more buses on routes where we can. Buses traditionally are not easy and not very cost effective, but small, more responsive, on-demand services are. And so I'll be looking to introduce on-demand Uber-style bus services that can respond much more better to our rural or sub-rural areas as well. So for me, it's about fundamentally driving a better public transportation system, as well as working alongside that, continuing to support the work that we're seeing already, and WECA is already investing in the future of automated travel, low carbon travel, and rolling out things like charging points that we've seen in places like South Gloucestershire.
Okay.
We need much more of those as well.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. Thank you. I'm going to now invite the same question from Stephen Williams, please. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, yes. I mean, as indicated in my opening remarks, we need to end the assumption that the solution to our transport problems is to build new roads. So I'm going to end that assumption straight away. But we also have to help people move away from feeling that they are dependent on their car to make often quite simple journeys. It's almost a psychological barrier that we have to break through. You know, as a boy, I played with little cars. Lots of people aspire to have a car. You don't feel as though you've made it in life until you own your own vehicle. And now it's quite common for households to have multiple vehicles. We've got to break that sort of psychological grip that motor vehicles have on us, but enable people to use their car or a car when it's appropriate. So, for instance, in every major urban road in Bristol and Bath, I live in Sefton Park Road, the largest straight road in Bristol, I would set aside at least one space in the road for an electric car club specifically for that road. And on larger roads, there could be more than one. In the 100 or so towns and villages around both the cities, I would set aside space in sort of parish hall car parks for the same thing. So every village has an electric car club so people can use a vehicle but not the petrol vehicle. I also want to make sure that our buses are cleaned up as well. That's why taking up the franchising powers is quite important. First, are only proposing to switch their current diesel buses away from that dirty fuel by 2035. That is too late. So I would use the power of franchising to accelerate that process so that all of the bus fleet is running on either electric or hydrogen by 2030, and preferably sooner than that. I would also lobby central government to complete the electrification of our rail network, so we move away from diesel trains as well. So we get electric trains to Parkway and the line that runs down Filton Bank from Cardiff to Temple Meads.
Sorry, thank you, Stephen. That's very clear and useful. Thank you very much. Jerome, last but definitely not least, could you outline to us how you would propose to ensure that we meet those carbon neutral challenges by 2030 in terms of transport? Thank you.
It's very simple, which is that we need to invest in public transport and cycling and walking infrastructure at the same time as reducing the number of cars on the road. And we really need to tackle the number of cars on the road with some additional forms of restriction. If it's easy to drive, then making public transport or cycling and walking more appealing isn't going to be enough on its own. We also need to think about the investment that's needed. So buses in our region get £2 subsidy a year compared to £75 subsidy per year per person in London. That's 30 times higher. In order to give people those public transport options, we need to get more money into the bus service. The other aspect is that the speed at which buses move through our city centre at peak times is 6 miles an hour. Again, if we're not addressing the issue of excessive car use head on, we can't speed up and run a reliable bus service.
Thank you, Jerome. That's I like the idea that you think it's easy. We're delighted to hear that. We look forward to an easy transition. I have a few follow-up questions because we had quite so many questions in this space from our pre-question inputs. And the first one, I'm going to come back to you, Sam. You made no mention at all about cycling and walking measures. There's a lot of interest in that and the role that plays, but also in how you overcome conflicts for space in some of our kind of key routes between those different forms of transport, which can potentially have an effect on a number of issues that have been brought up, including active transport, but also in terms of bus speed and car usage. So can you, in 60 seconds or so, give us a sense of what your attitude to cycling and walking are, and how you'll overcome conflict around space on our roads?
There we go. Yes, absolutely. And two really great points. So firstly, in terms of cycling and walking, yes, I'm absolutely committed to rolling out further investment in cycling and walking infrastructure. I'm aware there's a lot of discussion around how we separate out both cycling and walking. And I think certainly in terms of strategy, there needs to be greater amount of investment in understanding how we focus on both cycling and walking as distinct transport modes. But the big thing for me is about joining together the very piecemeal approach that has happened across the authorities for cycle lanes. So there are so many cycle routes that go to nowhere. And so I would be looking to increase investment so we can join up our cycle lanes so that you can get around our region easily, safely, and quickly. And I want to use those cycle routes to create more linear parks as well. So green space running alongside those cycle lanes, planting more trees, creating green avenues, a web across our region using that cycle route. And in terms of bus and mixed space, it's about prioritization. We've seen in other cities around the world and other regions around the world where there is prioritization for buses and cycling that, again, makes that type of transport a preferred option, which takes me back to my opening statement about making it a preferred option. So I would look to prioritize things like traffic junctions and traffic lights.
Okay. I'm not sure that necessarily gets around the potential conflict issue, but I think we hear you in terms of that investment that you're talking about.
Yes, and prioritising those is the point I was making. Okay. Prioritising those types of travel.
That's fine. That's good. Thank you, Stephen. I'm quite interested in your thoughts about that conflict piece. You've been really clear about breaking those connections with the car and with some of the other specific things around franchises. But how would you deal with some of those conflicts, and how do we do that in a fair way? Because fairness is a really important part of this. So how do we ensure that conflict resolution is fair to those different communities that it affects in very, very different ways, as we know?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's the job of any politician, whether it's a metro mayor or any other level, to sort of hector and bully people into changing their behaviour. We have to take people with us and respect the fact that some people will want to move at different speeds along that transition to a greener society by 2030. But there are some things that in this region other regions have done, and we simply haven't done. We are so far behind in terms of our infrastructure provision for cyclists and walkers. Our regional rail network is absolutely pathetic compared to places like Cardiff and Birmingham. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that we can do, and we have to be realistic with what we're promising to people as well, and not pie-in-the-sky nonsense like a Bristol Underground. Because I think there's a lot of cynicism amongst the public that they hear about highfalutin ideas about how we can change in this region, but on the ground they don't see much actually changing. You know, the last new railway station to open in the West of England was in Yate in 1982, I think it was, when I was still in school. In fact, I was still in school at that time. So there's a lot of things we need to grasp and change. And in terms of the conflicts, there are conflicts in between sort of disabled or less able-bodied people who think that, you know, cycling and walking is not necessarily something for them, but it is something that a lot of people could take up. So bike security needs to be improved. I mentioned I want to set aside road space for electric car clubs in every street. I would also like to set aside space for bike hanners in streets as well. Particularly important in inner city Bristol, like Clifton, Cotton, Redland, Bedminster and so on, where lots of people live in flats but don't have anywhere secure in order to store their bike overnight. So bike hanners is something that would enable people to make that investment in a bike, whether it's leg powered or electric powered, and know it's still going to be there the next morning.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for that. And Jerome, just in terms of one or two responses to the things that you were saying, one question is particularly around that question around how do we make sure that this is fair? How do we ensure that transport investment benefits the most deprived communities who are often most affected by some of these sorts of issues? And also, how do we integrate it across the different authorities within the West of England, rather than it just be a piecemeal response? Can you give me a few thoughts on those two elements of your original question responses? Again, you've only got a minute or so. Oh, you're muted still, Jerome, sorry.
So in terms of the most deprived communities, I mean, it's a double deprivation if you live in an area where you're dependent on a car and you're on a low income, because you've got a high cost base and people would often love to be able to give up their cars, but don't feel that the alternative is there. So how it is that we bring down public transport, we bring down bus costs in particular, and improve bus services, so that, for example, if you want to get from Hartcliffe to Avonmouth, you've got an affordable public transport option rather than being over dependent on your car, is really important. And the same thing applies across the region and in rural areas. And in terms of how we work between the different authorities, people live in Bath and work in Bristol, or they live in North East Somerset and they work in Bath, and South Gloucestershire is a huge magnet employer. People need to move around the region. You know, it's a travel to work region, the WECA region, and I think that when you talk to businesses and you talk to individuals and even you talk to the local politicians, they really want a sort of integrated approach to the way that transport works in the region. So I think I'd be knocking at an open door by having those sorts of conversation. You know, the Portishead to Temple Meads line is a really good example of a rail line that runs from North Somerset into Bristol, and it works for both local authorities. I recognise that North Somerset isn't part of WECA at the moment.
Yeah, that's a whole other question. Okay, thanks, Jerome. Okay, so we're going to, I've got another question that is a little bit sort of out of your remit, but it was a very, very popular question in our pre-event questionnaire. And what it is that we recognise that the expansion of Bristol Airport is outside of the WECA area and not within the jurisdiction of the Metro Mayoral role. But we would still like to know, with a yes or no answer, are you in favour of the expansion of Bristol Airport? And if the answer is no, you're not, will you commit to writing to the inquiry, appeal and objecting? And with just 60 seconds, I'm going to be really strict on this one, to explain your answer. We would like to to ask how you see the airport in the future of WECA. So do you approve of the expansion, yes or no? I know we've already heard an answer from one of you in your points. And how do you see the role of the airport in the future of WECA? So I'm going to start this one with Stephen, please.
Well, the easy answer is yes, I oppose Bristol Airport expansion, not just the current one that has been determined by North Somerset Council and may now go to appeal, but I oppose the previous expansion as well over a decade ago. Because I was a member of Parliament at the time, the airport were absolutely desperate to get all 11 MPs in the West of England area to unanimously agree to airport expansion. I think this was 2006, this would have been, and I was the one who held out against that at the time and said, no, I wasn't in favour of it. So I've got a long track record of saying we cannot allow exponential growth of aviation. So I've opposed airport expansion to Bristol both occasions. I also oppose the third runway as well. I'm one of the people who Greenpeace bought a little parcel of land for in the area west of London where the third runway would be. So I'm one of the people who would have to be compulsorily bought out if the third runway ever were to see the light of day, though I suspect because of changing economic circumstances it probably won't now, so at least that's one benefit maybe from COVID.
Thank you, Stephen. So the same question to you, Jerome, a yes or a no? If it's a no, will you commit to objecting, and can you give us your thoughts on how you see the future of the airport within WECA?
Absolutely. I mean, as I said in my opening answer, I would oppose the expansion of the airport, and Wright has requested to do so. In December, I was the councillor who proposed the motion reversing Bristol Council's support for the airport expansion. And it is a huge additional carbon burden on the region, and it's one where we need to make the tough choices and recognise that jobs need to come from elsewhere, and it's perfectly possible, and it's a great opportunity for jobs to come from elsewhere. And in terms of the way that I see the airport in the future, flying is an incredible privilege for our generation and my children's generation. It's a wonderful way of experiencing the world, of seeing family in different places. It's just that we need to fly a bit more responsibly. And sort of act as if, you know, be really aware of the carbon impact, so that if we do fly, we're not just going for a weekend, we're going for a longer period. If we're traveling within Europe, it's, you know, it can be a really delightful experience and part of the holiday to travel by train. So keeping flying for essential purposes and flying responsibly, rather than unnecessary frequent flying.
Okay, thank you for that. And same question to you, Samuel.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm not against the expansion as a fundamental point of principle. Why? Because as far as I see it, flying is not the enemy. In fact, carbon is not actually the enemy. Anthropogenic carbon overload is the enemy, what we need to reduce and change. So we don't want to get rid of flying, actually. We need to decarbonize it. And in my experience in business, in investment, in innovation, is that investment drives innovation. And what I would like to see, and I think we've seen this just today, we've seen in the FT today, 11 trillion pounds of private investment will and funding wanting to drive banks to decarbonize. What I would like to see is an R&D partnership between the airport and people like Airbus, people like Rolls-Royce, people like DETI, people like across the region are already driving forward the future of flight, of decarbonisation. And what I'd like to see is private organisations committing to driving forward a decarbonised future. And I think we're seeing this, we're seeing private businesses leading the way, and I'd love to see us as a region driving the region forward. And just to pick up very quickly on a point that Jerome makes, it's about a carbon burden on the region, is what he mentioned, but actually the carbon burden will continue, as is continuing in Heathrow, and we need to reduce that carbon burden, which will just be pushed down the road, which we don't want.
Okay, we're lighting up the chat here because there are some people agreeing with you, and there are many others thinking that innovation may not come in time for the climate emergency we're facing. So it's good to split opinion. I guess that's the whole point of hustings. I am going to move on to the next question, which is still about, of course, the climate emergency, but this time we're going to be focusing a bit more on a different area of it, which is food and our food resilience. It has never been a more important time to talk about food policy. The pandemic has emphasised the importance of building resilience within our food system and increased the urgency we face in making radical change to reverse the tide. Our food system is heavily implicated in loss of biodiversity to industrial agriculture, in global gas emissions from livestock farming and food transport, and in its enormous carbon footprint from wasted food. What could you do within your powers as Metro Mayor to enable this radical change and ensure our food system is resilient to the impacts of climate change, reduces carbon emissions, and supports nature's recovery? I am going to ask Jerome to respond to that quite long question, but very important one, I think, within 90 seconds or so, I'm afraid. Big question, short amount of time. Over to you, Jerome.
Thank you. So I think it's absolutely right. Prioritising our sustainable food growers and producers solves so many problems for us as a society. It reduces carbon, it increases employment, and it helps wildlife. And the way that I would want this to work if I was Metro Mayor is build on some of the successes that we've had in the region. I'm thinking of the Bristol food strategy and who feeds Bristol, and bring that same quality of thinking, well resourced, into the West of England with that combination of urban and rural, food consumers and food producers. So to develop a food strategy that works for our region, that increases sustainable food growing, that works on those connections between producers and suppliers, enables there to be alternatives to the supermarkets for distribution, which makes food produce much more profitable for the people who are growing it. That's what I would be working on. And I believe that our region has got fantastic potential to be increasing the number of people on the land and solving those problems that I was describing.
Oh, I said, great, thank you very much, Jerome, but I was muted. You'd think I'd have got past this by now, wouldn't you? So I'm going to ask the same question to you, Samuel, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really aware of the need for urban food production, for regional food production. I come from a farming background. My uncle is still farming in the Cotswolds, and I've worked in my career to develop climate resilient agriculture. I was in Bangladesh not long ago, looking at projects around how we can introduce new climate resilient agriculture there. And I think we can learn a lot from those types of innovations around mixed crops, around smallholder crops. And I'd like to build upon some of the really exciting and very positive stuff that we've seen across our region. I'm thinking about the Let Us Grow and the work that happened there around and the innovations there, hydroponics work that they've done, the urban lots. I'd like to encourage allotments and personal growing of food. I think this is a fantastic thing. Bristol in particular, there's great desire for allotments, and I think we can do more about creating space and land for the creation of more allotments and local growing. And also I'd look to creating more funds available, more grants and funding available for those regional urban food production and regional food production to support their businesses, so that local businesses, farmers can scale and grow and produce more food locally, so that we can cut down on those food miles that sadly are connected to so much of what we eat today.
Thank you very much, Samuel. And last but not least, Stephen, over to you on making our food system resilient and sustainable.
Well, I think it was about 8 or 9 years ago that the report on Who Feeds Bristol came out. And I remember talking to the author, I think from the top of my head, Joy Carey, maybe wrong about that, at the time. And I'm not sure a great deal has changed in the meantime about getting people to understand where their food comes from and being able to make informed choices. So I think that's what we need to do here, is to enable people to know whether they're able to make that conscious choice to buy locally in their local shops. So one of the ideas that I have in my manifesto is to have a West of England product mark. We've just left the European Union, so a lot of protections and product marks that we used to have as a member of the single market have just disappeared, or at least they've disappeared in terms of legal force. So I'd like to have a voluntary West of England product mark for our region, so people can see where the vegetables are coming from, where the meat's coming from, where the cider's coming from, the cheese, and so on. And work with all of our local retailers, whether they're the independent sector or the multiples, to specifically have stations set aside in their shops for local produce. The question was framed in terms of within the powers of the regional mayor. And that's actually quite a good framing of the question for almost everything tonight, because our actual powers are quite strictly delineated. But what we have the most of is pretty hefty soft power. Whoever is elected to this position will have the biggest electoral mandate in local government in the south of England, other than the Mayor of London. Used sensibly and sensitively, that is actually quite a powerful tool to bring people together in order to affect change. But in this area, I think it's information that is really powerful, so that people can see whether that vegetable has come from a farm in northeast Somerset, or whether it's been flown in from Kenya. Whereas at the moment, it's not immediately obvious to people who, let's face it, are often in a rush when they go shopping.
Okay, I think we may come back to this, because I think there were quite a few questions beforehand, and I think there are some coming up in the Q&A about a bit more of a sort of systems approach to this, and about how we support food security across the system, thinking about food waste and thinking about the kind of connectivity, which I think with the regional approach rather than a very local one will be key. But let's see where we get to when we get to the Q&A towards the end of this session. Okay, so we're going to slightly shift focus from the climate emergency, which is obviously deeply important, to the very, very connected ecological emergency. And on this question, we're looking at knowing that wildlife is collapsing and that it is fundamental to support life of the planet. What would you do in your areas of control to rebuild nature in this area? And I'm, again, like I did with the transport one, I'm going to just give a little bit more information in here. Acknowledging that preserving, restoring and enabling access to green space came up as a very prominent theme in the questions we received from the public. A priority for many people has been being critical to the economic and social well-being of our community, and that good physical and mental health are supported by regular engagements with nature, and this engagement is facilitated by high access to natural environments. So that green spaces piece is important to people, but it's really, really important that we dig deeper than that and think about how we match the scale of the emergency we're facing, when 41% of species have declined in the UK since 1970. So we're not just talking about green spaces, important though they are, but we're also talking about serious decline in the biodiversity of life on our planet. So how within your areas of influence, particularly around strategic development, around housing and where industry goes, and about the sort of joint transport strategy, how will you be using those particular powers to really support a significant change in the ecological disaster that we are looking at? So I'm going to start that question off with Stephen, please.
Thanks, Liz. I mentioned in my introductory remarks that one of the things I would stop is the Callington Road, which runs along a corridor of land called the Brislington Greenway, an old railway line. And if you go there at the moment, I have been down there with the local councillors. It's a nice wildlife corridor that is completely wilded and really doesn't deserve to be spoiled. And I would like to have many more of those links from cities, our two cities, and from our towns out into the countryside, sort of green corridors reaching out that people can walk and cycle along, and wildlife can use as well. In terms of the land use powers, I've said clearly in my manifesto that I want all new housing communities to be built both in a socially balanced way, but also in an ecologically balanced way, so that you have planting schemes within those new communities that have a mixture of native trees, and not just one particular tree, in order to support biodiversity and pollinators. I mentioned in the question on food that I was interested in having a more clear understanding of produce, but also a clearer understanding of the country around us as well. So having partnerships, say, between urban schools, I live just up the hill from St Paul's and Werburgh's, and with some of our rural schools as well. And that's, again, is an example of the soft power and networking influence that the regional mayor has to bring together, say, kids in Nemsnet-Thrubwell, my favourite place name in the whole region, to Montpellier, say.
Great, thank you very much for that. Jerome, would you like to respond to that question next?
Yeah, so I mean, it's about reducing our human impact on the ecology locally, and in terms of land use for development, we're very blessed by the sort of greenfield belts that surround Bristol and surround Bath, and we need to protect those as far as possible. Work at building on brownfield sites, so there are still significant levels of brownfield sites that are available, and not been over dependent on car use in the immediate region. There are some very clear requests that the West of England Nature Partnership has put forward, and I'd be supportive of all of those. So doubling our woodland, planting 1 million native trees, improving flood drainage to, which improves flood drainage and captures carbon and provide habitat for wildlife. And similarly, as Stephen said, developing these green wildlife spaces and corridors, really important to allow animals to move about freely, making sure that our water catchments are healthy for wildlife, in line with clean water targets and working with the statutory agencies. Ending unnecessary pesticide use, also absolutely key. And I think a lot of people don't know where pesticides are being applied. So getting a greater sort of reporting on what pesticide is going where is a really essential part of communities being able to act on it, whether they're rural communities or urban communities.
Great, thanks very much, Jerome. And last but not least, Samuel, over to you on your plans for both protecting and enhancing our ecology.
Yeah, thank you. And so in terms of the protecting, I would be looking absolutely to be protecting our green belt, our green spaces. I think that's really important when we think about spatial development. And so prioritising brownfield regeneration. We've got a lot of brownfield sites, both within urban areas and actually out across towns and even villages that could absolutely see regeneration happening within those slots rather than having to dig into greenbelt or greenfield sites. That's really, really important for us to be doing that. But as we think about development as well, I want to really encourage and prioritize the nature-friendly development. There's some really positive developments that we can see people developing at the moment around how we integrate our homes and our living in union with our environment rather than in conflict with, which is the way that so much development happens at the moment. And so I would welcome that and prioritize that within the development of the spatial development strategy. I'd also be looking, I mentioned earlier about green corridors. running like a web throughout our region. That's really important, as I mentioned earlier, for us to get around the region, for us to be able to access green spaces, to increase ground cover, which is of course positive, very important in these hot hubs that are our cities in particular, but so that people can then access green space as well. And I'd also be looking to lobby government more to unlock more funding to support our rural economy, and particularly our agriculture. Agricultural practices have in some ways damaged our green spaces, our biodiversity, and we need to unlock that funding so that it really is public money for public good, so that we can enrich our biodiversity. And so I'd be looking to do that and support local farmers in that as well.
Okay, thank you. There's quite a few comments coming up and questions coming up about access to green space. So you've talked quite a bit about protecting space, but I'd quite like to hear just a few comments from each of you about how do we broaden access to green space so that we get those wellbeing benefits. I might do that in reverse order. So Samuel, we've just heard from you. So do you want to give us literally just a few comments on those, please?
Yeah, absolutely. As I've mentioned, I think that these green corridors, strengthening our transport system, our active transport system, so that people can get out of the city, but also caring for our parks and our green spaces. We've not done that brilliantly well across the region, and I'd look to introducing more park maintenance, more green space maintenance, so that we can create these spaces that are rich in biodiversity and on our doorstep. We've got spaces, but we need to care for them in a much more integrated fashion.
Okay, and I think as people are pointing out here on chat, you know, this is not just about preserving what we have, but we really need to be investing in increasing the biodiversity in those spaces, including green spaces. Stephen, what are your thoughts on that access issue?
Well, on access, I think it needs to be clearer and easier. A confession, I have a bike, and I've had a bike for a long time, but I wasn't a particularly regular cyclist until the COVID lockdown just over a year ago, because my preferred form of exercise is swimming. But when Hawfield Pool closed, I thought, well, what can I do now? So I started cycling around Bristol in a way I'd never really done before. And apart from overcoming the fear of traffic and other road users, the actually biggest problem was finding out where on earth I could go and where I could go safely, and accessing that information online, of course, at the time, because Tours Information Centre was shut, everywhere was shut, libraries were shut, where I may have picked up some maps. And when I got towards some routes like the Bristol Bath Pass, it wasn't always obvious where you could get on and off it. I think for people who were very familiar with it, some of these things are obvious, but for occasional users or first-time users, it really does need to be made obvious. So I think simple things like improving the signposting of how you access safe routes, quiet routes, and so on would make an enormous difference. There's often the little things we can do to increase people's confidence and then increase participation in people moving about.
Okay, thank you. And Jerome, thoughts on access to green space particularly?
Yes, I mean, I think that in the number one reason why people don't take up cycling is their fear for their safety, and serious investments in cycling and walking allow people to feel more comfortable. And the litmus test of that is, does a 12-year-old feel safe cycling on their own to school? And there are so many places in the city and the region where that's simply not possible. I think that maintenance of our parks and green spaces and feeling safe inside those is really important. And there are some strategic investments that we could make as well. So, I mean, the Whitchurch cycle path, which is an old disused railway line, is not nearly as extensively used as the Bath to Bristol railway line, but that goes all the way to Pensford. And with money that was going into the South Bristol Ring Road, that would be a fabulous opportunity to get a route out into the North Somerset countryside that really opened up the sort of the beauty of our region to a sort of a whole different set of communities.
Okay, Thank you. We are going to move to another area, but before I do that, I just wanted to remind the audience, firstly, there's loads of fantastic stuff coming in through the comments. I inevitably haven't been able to keep full track of them, but we will share them after the event with all the candidates. So if you're asking very specific questions and you want that to be on the minds of those who may well soon have much more power than they currently do, we will pass those on. And also some of the questions that you submitted or voted for as the Q&A has gone on have now been covered. So if you do continue to add those questions, we've got a huge number of them now, but also if you want to change your voting for which one's the most important because you feel one of them's already been covered, you are able to just switch your vote over. So do feel free to get involved in both of those as we go. So the next question is much more to do with the fair side of our swift transition that we require very urgently to a carbon neutral future. The question as it stands is that many young people and others in the WECA region are at risk of a jobless future as a result of the pandemic. And at the same time, there is a risk that the scale and pace of change we need to achieve the carbon neutral target of 2030 will be held back through the lack of appropriate trained workforce. And again, I'm going to give a little bit of background to this. The UK has experienced a youth unemployment emergency. People between the age of 16 and 24 have suffered enormous job losses during the pandemic, and over 7,000 young people in this age group are out of work in the West of England alone. Alongside this, of course, there's this yawning gap in the skills needed to transform the West of England's homes, businesses and transport, all of which the Metro Mayor has a significant influence over to meet our zero carbon ambitions. It's also important to recognise that this crisis affecting youth unemployment is also unequal in its effects, and that young Black people are 3 times as likely to be jobless as their white peers. So there's a huge amount of inequality, particularly in youth unemployment, and at the same time we've got this massive skills gap if we're really going to transition to a carbon neutral economy. So how would you use your powers, budget and influence to address this double challenge and to ensure young people get the skills and support they need to benefit equally from this zero carbon transition? And I'm going to ask Samuel to start that one, please.
Yeah, thank you. And it's a huge issue, and like you say, it's really multifaceted, isn't it? And that really reiterates the importance of us adopting a system view to a lot of these challenges. And I think for far too long, tackling the climate crisis has been very sector specific or siloed, and I'd look to integrate that as much as possible and have a system view. Some of the key things that I'm very keen on launching, that I'll be looking to launch very early on if elected, so as to ensure that there are access to jobs and jobs of the future, green jobs, and that it's fair and inclusive, are this. Well, I'll be looking to firstly launch collaborative future work forums and collaborative future skills forums. And the intention of this is that we've got such fantastic businesses, apprenticeship opportunities, employers, and we've got a great workforce, and we've got great education providers, but we absolutely need to start joining those up so that the businesses and the employers can start informing the direction of future jobs, where innovation is going, where R&D is leading, and what jobs of the future we will need. So we need to start taking that on, and we need to start being led by business and education with that. And so I'll be launching these collaborative future forums very soon. I'll be continuing and absolutely committing to at least £100 million over the next 4 years for the recovery of our skills and business, so that we can make sure that we are supporting these areas, and seeking absolutely further funding, because we need to unlock further funding. We're seeing only the tip of the iceberg of job losses and the challenge that will be ahead, particularly for young people, as we've seen. And so we must engage with that. And the last 2 things that I'll mention that I'll be looking to launch very early on is our community ambassadors. There's been a real issue with engaging with certain demographics and certain communities across our region. We need to improve that, the level of engagement. So I'll be bringing on community ambassadors who are dedicated in engaging with our communities, and particularly those communities who are often underrepresented. And I'll be also looking to launch a mentoring scheme so that those young people who are ready to engage, ready to learn, and are looking for opportunities, we can do that, and we can link them with some of our fantastic leaders that we've got across the region so that we can provide high quality mentoring and encouragement for those people. So there's some of the key things.
Okay, I would, if you're looking at community ambassador programs, I would recommend everyone look at the fantastic Green and Black initiative that the Green Partnership launched in the last few years. That's really doing a brilliant job in that space, and equally the Business West, who are members of the initiative, the partnership, have got very interesting. You want business to inform you, then they've got some fantastic ideas about the green recovery that is required. So I am going to ask, where are we now? Jerome, I'm just trying to make sure we're all doing it in the right order so it's fair and equal. Jerome, could you give us a response to that question about how we deal with these very connected challenges?
Yeah, I mean, and talk in terms of fairness and equality, I've signed the Universal Basic Income Pledge, which would be to trial universal basic income, which would need government support in the region. I think we've seen through COVID how random life can be when it comes to whether you're rewarded, whether you get furlough, whether you get grants of various kinds. Our benefit system was thought to be just about working, but a crisis come along like COVID comes along and it exposes its fundamental unfairness and fragility. So we're working within that bigger picture, and I would do what I could to trial universal basic income. With regards to the jobs of the future and making sure that they're fair, we need the stable market opportunities for the shift to the low carbon society. We've seen such a range of energy efficiency schemes come and go with such a mess from national government. It's impossible to run an energy efficiency, or it's really difficult to run an energy efficiency business when the policy framework is changing and keeps pulling the rug from underneath the feet of people who are trying to operate within that policy framework. So some of what we could do in WECA is use that funding that's there to provide a stable policy framework on, for example, home energy efficiency improvements, so that we could be developing a core of really skilled people who were able to demonstrate best practice, and in the way that the West of England often does, lead nationally. You know, we can be so good at that, so that national government simply can't ignore the quality of what we're doing. And then using the skills budget, we can just do more to invest in the right skills, with a particular attention on the most deprived communities and making sure that they are well served by that skills budget.
Okay, thank you, Jerome. And Stephen, your thoughts on that dual challenge of youth unemployment and the climate emergency response, skills gap?
Yeah, this is a good mix of economics and green aspirations. I mean, if you look at who's been impacted by COVID, obviously some sectors have been hit far harder than others, and it's probably retail, hospitality, and tourism that have taken an almighty battering in the last 13 months, whereas a lot of other salaried jobs, of course, people have been furloughed or maybe have carried on working, albeit from different settings. So in order to support those sectors that have been hit the hardest, I'd ask for extra powers to be devolved from central government. That's one of the things that regional mayors can do, and our current Conservative regional mayor hasn't asked for anything to be devolved at all to this region since 2017. So I'd specifically ask for full control of business rates to be devolved to the West of England, so that you can calibrate what you charge on high streets and what you charge on out of town activities and so on. I'd like to introduce an overnight stay levy, which is quite normal when we get back to traveling to other parts of Europe. People are used to or don't even notice the fact that you're paying effectively a local levy if you're staying in a nice European city. We should have that here in Bath and Bristol as well. And the proceeds of that would be reinvested in the visitor economy, in our heritage sector, in basic things such as toilets, which have been cut back enormously in recent years. I would also use the hard power of the regional mayor, which is over skills. It's an area where arguably it's the most important power that the regional mayor has. There are a multi-100 million pound skills budget. I would bring together all the colleges and private sector training providers and apprenticeship schemes to make sure that we are training young people, and indeed people at other stages in their life, for those green jobs of the future, such as what Jerome mentioned in terms of retrofitting our homes, which is going to be absolutely essential. I'll also use the soft power of the regional mayor to bring together our 4 universities and larger innovative companies to set up what I've called a West of England Centre for Green Technological Excellence, so that we're innovating on both products and services and making sure that we design the packages that are necessary to have that sustainable and socially just future as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. We've got a final planned question, which is also around this fair and equal question overall. It says, can you tell us how the measures you have proposed this evening are going to be implemented in a way that meets the need for urgency, but does so in a way that is fair and that ensures that the most vulnerable groups are not disproportionately affected by climate change and the transition to net zero? So how will your actions protect those communities whose voices are least heard but most impacted? So you've all mentioned a lot of different actions. You probably can't go through each one of those in turn, but I would like you to help us to understand how you will ensure that those measures you have proposed are implemented in ways that do indeed protect the planet, but also protect the most vulnerable communities in our region. And I am going to reverse the order, and I'm going to start with you, Stephen, please.
This again is a mix of where you can use the soft and hard powers of the mayor, and the soft power is really bringing people together. We've got some areas in the West of England, we're the most prosperous city region outside Edinburgh and London. We have got pockets of deprivation, such as Barton Hill and Lawrence Hill, Southmead, Knoll West, and so on in Bristol, and Twerton in Bath as well. And I would bring together all the local employers who are near those areas together to make sure that they're reaching out to people in the nearby communities and making them aware of the jobs that are often available on their doorstep. I remember meeting with James Freeman when he was MD of First Bus, saying he had a devil of a job recruiting bus drivers in Bristol, even though his major bus depot was right in the heart of a part of East Bristol where there was structural high unemployment. So I'd use the soft power of the mayor to reach into those communities and bring employers to them. Also, transitioning to that green future, a lot of people will feel it's not for them, simply because they can't afford it, or their lives are so busy and complicated that it's not easy for them to clearly see how they don't use their car or they don't shop at a particular shop or whatever. So you have to work with people in a more holistic way. And sometimes you have to help them economically as well. So some people simply cannot afford to buy a bike in order to ride to work. So I would set up schemes with large local employers to make sure that there are capital schemes available to enable people to invest in a leg-propelled bike, or in some circumstances an electric bike, or maybe a scooter if they become legal in the future as well. All of us who are on this call are committed to an agenda of having a green society by 2030 or maybe 2050 in some cases. But we have to remember, not everyone understands that needs to move to that particular future at high speed. So we have to bring people with us. And sometimes that means dialing down the rhetoric and involving people in how they can shape their own local community. So I think we have to be much more holistic quite often to make sure that we're bringing people with us.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Samuel, would you like to respond to that question about how we do this swiftly for the planet, but also in a way that protects vulnerable communities?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, I can't go through everything I've shared, but I'd like to go back to what I started by saying, which is the need for adaptation, doing things differently, which for me is significantly important, is about instituting this Sustainable Development Goal lens for everything the West of England does. Now, I know on the call, I'm sure there'll be a mixed view of the SDGs, but I think what the SDGs present really well is a system view, a view that is able to recognize the need for swift action, for beyond sustainability approach that is restorative, that is inclusive, but also recognizes that there is economic growth opportunity. The SDGs suggest that there will be, I think, 12.5 or 13 trillion in new money created by the sustainable economy. This is only a fraction of development so far that we're seeing within that. And so there is opportunity and there is challenge. That's why I will be looking to implement this very system view approach to everything that we do. And in terms of the programs that looks like, I've mentioned, of course, the community ambassadors, the collaborative future forums, so that we can ensure that we are listening and learning, and that actually the answers are driven, yes, in a strategic system view, but are driven by us all, the residents of the West of England, rather than a bureaucratic organization thinking it knows best, which is absolutely not my view. It needs to be driven by our communities, by our businesses, by our education and our research. And so I think that sets the parameters of which I would look to implement very quickly for the results we need.
Okay, thank you, Samuel. And Jerome, would you like to respond to that pretty big question in a fairly brief manner, please?
Yeah, I mean, so our starting point is having a vision of society which is fairer and more equal, where everybody can play an active part as a citizen, where it's cheap to get around, and where we've all got access to the good basics of life, rather than this sort of very unequal situation that we're finding ourselves in now, and is the way that the country and the West has been evolving over the last 30 years. So that vision of the shared inclusive future has to be the starting point. And then looking at the way that we're making spending decisions with that prism of the sort of more equal inclusive society. So, you know, if we are looking at 50 million quid of road building, we should be looking at what the alternatives are to be spending that money in a way which really benefits everybody, and particularly our most deprived communities. So getting that balance right between what kind of capital expenditure are we actually making? Is it the capital expenditure that will benefit people who are already quite wealthy, or is it investment in public transport and cycling and walking infrastructure, which can benefit nearly everybody? So the choice about what kind of capital investment is the first strand, and then what's the right balance between actually putting money into services so that we are, for example, dropping the price of bus tickets, which makes public transport much more accessible to people who currently find it unaffordable. Then I think there's making sure that when we're making investments in high streets, for example, we've got lots of sort of high streets around the region that are in desperate need of financial support, but with a little bit of investment, with a bit of strategic investment from WECA, could really generate a snowball effect of positive investment. So it's that combination of things that I think will help for a more equal, inclusive approach.
Thank you very much, Jerome. That's really useful. So that's a lot we've taken in already. We've covered quite a lot of different ground. There are still quite a lot of elements that we haven't covered, inevitably. There are lots of comments coming into the Q&A about, which are kind of questions rather than comments. And can I just remind you that the questions that we're particularly focusing on for the next 15-20 minutes are the ones in the Q&A part of the Zoom webinar space. So please, if you have questions, please put them on there and we will do our best to get to some of them. We have had this voting system in place throughout the evening, so people have voted, although some of these, of course, were voted on before people have already answered them. So I'm going to use a little bit of chair's prerogative to work through those. But we're going to turn to some of those questions now, if that's all right with everybody else. And then we will do some summing up in a moment. So the question that has had the most votes, which is interesting, I'm going to come to each of you briefly on this. I'm only going to give you about 60 seconds on each of these questions so we can get through as many as possible. And I think there's an important phrase in this question that probably relates to other areas as well. How will the panelists ensure they hold developers to account? And it's that holding people to account that I think will be particularly important in this role, to ensure that proper protection of wildlife and green spaces. Currently in Bristol, the Council Planning Department report that they don't yet reflect the ecological or climate emergencies in their policies or approach. So how will you ensure across the region that developers and planning decision-making overall holds proper protection of wildlife and green spaces to account? I'm going to come first to Stephen.
Well, the land use plan that we should have in place at the moment, of course, was thrown out by the inspectors. So we don't have an up-to-date regional land use plan in place. And that will be an urgent task of whoever takes up this position in a few weeks' time, to bring together the three authorities to make sure that we do have a legal structure and spatial plan in place. And as I said earlier, one of my key principles that I want in that is that for all new development, and there is going to have to be new development outside Bristol, around the edges of some of our existing towns and villages, is done in a way that is socially balanced, but is also ecologically balanced as well. And if you embed those presumptions in an existing land use plan, then that has weight, as the system is the appropriate word in law. That has weight in the planning system, so that when developers come along, they know what the expectation on them is to respond to the ecological emergency. But we also have to make sure as a regional authority that we're putting the public transport infrastructure in alongside as well. So if you have more development in Thornbury, we've got to do something about the A38, for instance, into Bristol. But in terms of enforcing on developers, that is an issue for the three local authorities. And I think all of them probably need to pay more attention to the fact that once planning permission is given for something, that you enforce the actual requirements that were placed on the developer at the time of granting that application. But that is a local authority issue, not a regional issue.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Jerome next, please.
So getting our spatial development strategy right as a region, which is really where is it that homes should be built, and that has failed. And I, as Metro Mayor, would work with the local authorities to make sure that the choice for the sites for new homes will be going in the right places with minimal impact, where there are existing public services, where there's existing transport provision. We also have to challenge the stranglehold, that's probably slightly overstating it, which volume house builders have on the type of development that takes place in our region. We far too often have, after the sort of change in the abolition of sustainable building codes when Stephen was minister, we don't have sufficiently strong controls on the energy efficiency of new properties that are going up. So it's not requirement to have solar panels. We've got too many detached houses that are being built, which lose heat through their walls. If we look at what the Community Land Trust is doing, there's some fabulous work that's taking place at the moment, and that moves away from the detached houses with 2 parking spaces. We've got much more sort of communal living, diversity of housing types that are there, and then there's more space for green space and growing projects within that community, and it fits our natural, it fits what people want. I mean, I think one of the things people have learned through COVID is how important different communities, how important functioning communities are, and having housing that enables that to happen with green space and a variety of relationships is really important.
Yeah, okay, thank you. There have been some interesting comments actually about the 15-minute neighbourhood planning type policy, which might be an interesting one if we had more time to discuss. Samuel, can you talk us through how you're going to hold those developers to account for ecological issues?
Yeah, thank you. And I think there's some good points have already been made, certainly around land use and the need to set out plan and aspiration within the SDS to prioritise that nature-friendly development that I mentioned earlier. That's really important. But further to that, I want to incentivise good practice, and so how we invest as a region in modern methods of construction, how we work with and invite developers who are looking to pioneer in this way. And what I'm delighted to say is that we have got some really great developers in this region who are pioneering modern methods of construction. The work that Jez is doing at the Housing Festival alongside others is really fantastic, and we must encourage that and build greater partnership. And so I'll look to work closely with them. Further to that, I'm a big fan of community-led housing developments, and I would be looking to prioritise community-led housing development, and as much as possible giving the power into the hands of communities. And this can be done on scale. We look to Cambridgeshire, I think there's 550 or 600 house developments that are community led. So this is not only about small scale development. And lastly, I would point out the importance of empowering our SME sectors, our smaller builders who often hold really good environmental credentials, want to deliver, but and can do a great job, and we must support them more. So it'd be that type of partnership approach that I'd look to adopt.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to merge two, we're running out of time a little bit, so I'm going to merge two questions. Well, I'm not going to ask them both at the same time, and I want an almost yes or no answer. I know that's difficult for politicians, but I'm going to attempt it. So there's two questions here. One says, the government recently published the Economics of Biodiversity. This is a brand new approach to bringing nature within economics. Are the candidates aware of this? And how will they act on the recommendations of the report, if you are aware of it? And the second one, which is also a fairly yes or no one, is do you support the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill? I'm going to start with Jerome, please. So are you aware of those two elements and do you support them? Oh, you're still muted, Jerome.
Yes, I am. Is that the Gupta report, I think, the Economics of Biodiversity? And yes, I support the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill.
Okay. Do you want to give a 20 seconds on what you do to try and implement that report?
I think it's about working, it's about using the powers that we have to make sure that, you know, where homes go, what the transport system is like, and what we're investing in the sort of wildlife, increased tree planting, land use is all fitting within that framework. Okay,
thank you very much. Samuel.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I am aware of the report, and yeah, I'm broadly supportive of it. I like the approach of of how we understand both economic growth, I know we don't like that term, maybe economic prosperity alongside environmental biodiverse goals. And we absolutely need that approach as far as I'm concerned. I saw earlier someone mention Kate Raworth and donut economics. I think that's really helpful and a really helpful economic approach to how we see the world. The bill, I broadly like the bill. My issue with it is this, that there seems to be a reaction against carbon sequestration. And I think what we see from the IPCC AR5 report is that adaptation and carbon reduction will only get us so far. We need to then approach how we sequester carbon. And the bill seems to have an issue against sequestration and saying we need to reduce. I want to see both carbon sequestration and reduction working together in parallel, rather than one first and then the other after, which the bill, I feel, suggests.
All right, thank you. And Stephen, your thoughts on those two? Are you aware of them, and how would you enact them?
I wasn't aware of the government report, to be perfectly honest. Governments produce lots of reports. That's one I have to go away and research. But from what my two colleagues have just said about it, it sounds as though it's something we should be seeking to embed in our own land use plan for the region, the document that we now have to rewrite because it was botched 4 years ago. So that might be an opportunity, actually, to have a really up-to-date local structural plan. I am aware of the bill. I'm pretty sure that some of my Liberal Democrat colleagues in the House of Commons, including Vera Hobhouse, MP Bath, I think are the sponsors of that bill. Of course, it is a private member's bill, so it's an opportunity to get discussion around many issues. But unless the government gives it time, and I'm guessing not, it's not actually going to become law. But regional mayors do have lots of power, so I'll be looking to see what was in that bill that, even if it's not in law, that we might be able to implement locally.
Thank you. We are very fast running out of time. There's a very, very good pokey question that's been one of the most popular, which I'm about to ask, but I'm going to give a little bit of a prelim to it with a second question. So I'm going to put these two together. So I only need one answer, and I'm going to give you remarkably little time for this one. One of the questions here is the recommendations of Bristol Citizen Assembly, and we're aware this is beyond Bristol, but it's an interesting point they're making here. The recommendations of Bristol Citizen Assembly show that ordinary citizens are asking their leaders to be brave and bold in the response to air pollution. So I think the key bit there is that bit brave and bold. What new and innovative solutions would you do to implement tackling air pollution? But I'm going to make that as a sort of prelim to this really great big question that's been so popular all evening, is if money were no object, and what would be the most radical environmental policy you would like to introduce? So I'd like you to have that sense from the previous question from Mary Rose that, you know, the citizens of this region want you to be bold and brave. So I'm inviting you to be bold and brave now in response to this question. If money were no object, what would be the most radical environmental policy you would like to introduce? And I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to give me each of those. And I'm going to start with you, Sam, please.
Huge question. Yes, I'm a big supporter of citizens' assemblies, actually, done right. And I'm a big supporter of future citizens' assemblies that we've seen deliver really significant results, but really thinking far into the future, which we need to we need to see. What would be my biggest, most radical money no option? There would be lots of things, but actually I think one of the biggest challenges with not delivering on the targets that we need is fickle, fast-moving approaches. And so I would make sure that there was a single person or a single minister, but directed by something like a future citizens assembly to deliver on the goals that we need. It's less about money, it's more about driving through the policy we need.
Okay, thank you. Stephen.
Yeah, I think the regional mayor does need to be bold and innovative rather than timid and almost invisible, which has been the case for the last 4 years. And if people look at my my manifesto. Let's see, there's lots of bold ideas in there that I'd really like to have the chance to implement. But money is a constraint. But the question is, what if money weren't a constraint? I guess it would be reaching down into the people who we talked about several questions back, who don't have the time or the money to make the change that we would like everyone to make. So if money was no object, I would like to be able to offer people immediate grants to either get rid of their polluting car for a cleaner vehicle, an electric vehicle, or to follow the example of a trial scheme they're doing in the West Midlands, where the regional mayor there has been much more innovative, and give people a transport credit in order to give up their vehicle, which could, for instance, be a rail pass or electric bikes for everyone in the family and so on. So if money were no object, getting older cars off the streets really fast, something I'd like to do.
Okay, great. Jerome, over to you. The final word on this particularly bold question.
Invest enough money in new homes to end the crisis of homelessness and the affordability of housing, which so impacts young people and people on lower incomes.
Okay, thank you for your response and for being quite so brief when we are tight for time. Okay, we have been really impressed by the number and quality of questions we have received, and as I said at the upshot, we will gather together all of those questions and all of the comments, and there's some, again, really good suggestions. So I think this could be a fantastic education for whoever is the future Metro Mayor in some of the things that are fantastic ideas in this region. We're going to do a final poll. We started off with that poll, and this is a pretty simple yes or no poll to the whole audience. Has tonight changed your mind on who you will vote for, yes or no? Be interesting to see if anyone's been swung by this evening's debate. And we've had around about 200 participants all evening. That's a pretty good number. I think we're just coming to the close of that poll. Okay, so the poll is very interesting, actually. 32% of people have changed their mind this evening. That's quite a significant number, I would suggest. And 29% haven't, and 39% are still undecided. So hopefully they will go along to some of the other hustings that I know you're all involved in the next few weeks. So I'm just going to close that up. Okay, so I have got a few bits and pieces to finish up on. Firstly, I would like to remind any of the people watching in to this webinar, if they are Bristol based, that Bristol is also deciding on its mayor, and on the evening of 27th of April, so next Tuesday, Bristol Green Capital Partnership are also doing a hustings for that, so please do join them. I think the link has been put in the chat. And I mentioned earlier the fantastic Black and Green Ambassadors programme that is run by the partnership, and they have a radio show every week on Ujima at 10 a.m. on not every week, sorry, at 10 a.m. next Thursday on Ujima Radio, where they'll be chatting to all of the mayoral candidates about their commitments to ensure that just transition to a zero carbon Bristol, and they'll particularly be focusing on air pollution and access to green space, and I know there have been a lot of questions on air pollution that we haven't fully drilled down into this evening, so that's a good one to look out for Bristol viewers. I really want to thank all of the partners who've collaborated with the Bristol Green Capital Partnership to organise this event. That includes Avon Wildlife Trust, the Black and Green Ambassadors, Ujima Radio, Bristol Food Network, CPRE Bristol and Avon, Friends of the Earth, Sustrans and Extinction Rebellion. I also really want to thank the candidates, of course. Huge pity that Dan Norris wasn't able to join us, but it's really is, I know it's difficult as mayoral candidates that you have to be experts on everything, and we've drilled down into some quite specific things this evening, but we really appreciate your time. We have one final poll, I believe, if that's popping up on the thing. Could you please Audience poll. As you leave the call, please leave us your feedback on the final poll, as you can see on your screens, and we hope to see you next Tuesday. So before you go, please do give us some feedback about this evening's hustings, and please accept our gratitude for the huge amounts of work that I know that all of the partners across the region, and also many of the people who I've seen popping up in this chat, do all of the time for this green transition. And I'm sure whoever is successful in the mayoral election, we collectively will be very much looking forward to working with you to ensure we do hit those very, very ambitious targets for 2030. So can I thank you all for your time, all three of you, and all of the audience for joining us this evening. And please do give us that feedback in the final poll to everybody in the audience. I think that's it. We're done. Thank you very much, everybody.
Ugh.